When the lawyer handed over the deed to a rotting, 60-year-old apple orchard, everyone told Rachel to sell it for scrap. It was worthless, cursed even. But the wealthy vultures circling the property didn't know what was buried beneath those dead roots. And honestly, neither did she. Rachel Higgins was at the end of her rope. At 32, she was drowning in $70,000 of business debt, facing eviction from her tiny Seattle apartment, and surviving on cheap ramen and tap water. Her graphic design agency had collapsed spectacularly, taking her life savings with it. When she received the letter from the law offices of Henson and Abernathy, she assumed it was another collection agency. Instead, it was a summons. Her grandfather, Caleb Higgins, had passed away a year ago, but his estate had been tied up in bureaucratic red tape. Rachel hadn't seen Caleb in over a decade. He was the family outcast, a paranoid, eccentric hermit who spent the last 30 years of his life fortified inside his property in Oak Haven, Oregon, a small logging and farming town that time seemed to have forgotten. Sitting in the stuffy, wood-paneled office of David Henson, Rachel felt entirely out of place in her thrift store blazer. David, a man whose weary eyes suggested he had dealt with too many messy family disputes, slid a heavy manila folder across his desk. "Your grandfather didn't have much liquid capital, Rachel," David said, adjusting his glasses. "In fact, his bank accounts were nearly drained. But he did leave you the entirety of his real estate, the Whispering Pines orchard." Rachel frowned, opening the folder to see faded aerial photographs of a sprawling 40-acre property. But the trees weren't green. They were stark, grey, and dead. "An orchard?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought he just lived in a cabin in the woods." "It was a functioning apple orchard in the 1970s, David explained, leaning back in his leather chair. "But it suffered a severe blight in the late 80s. The soil went sour. The trees died. Caleb refused to sell, refused to clear the land, and eventually the town just wrote him off as a crazy old man living in a dead forest. The property taxes are severely delinquent. You have about 3 months to pay the county $14,000, or they will seize the land and auction it off." Rachel's heart sank. She didn't have $14, let alone $14,000. "So I inherited a massive tax bill and a graveyard of dead trees. Great. What are my options?" "Sell it," David said bluntly. "In fact, I already have a standing offer on my desk from Croft Enterprises. Anthony Croft has been buying up land in Oak Haven for a luxury housing development. He's offering $35,000 for the deed. It pays off the taxes and leaves you with about 20 grand. It's a lifeline, Rachel. $20,000 wouldn't clear her debt, but it would keep her out of bankruptcy court and put a roof over her head. It was the logical, safe choice." But as Rachel looked down at a small handwritten note clipped to the back of the deed, something twisted in her gut. The note was in her grandfather's frantic, jagged handwriting. "Rachel, don't let the wolves have the roots. Look deeper. Look under the iron." "I need to see it first," Rachel said, surprising herself. David sighed, a sound that conveyed both pity and frustration. "Rachel, it's a wasteland, but it's your wasteland now. Here are the keys." 2 days later, Rachel's beat-up Honda Civic sputtered up the winding, unpaved driveway of Whispering Pines. The reality of the property was far bleaker than the photographs. Rows upon rows of skeletal apple trees stretched out like twisted, grasping fingers against the overcast Oregon sky. The soil was a sickly, ashen color, choked with thorny weeds. At the center of the decay sat a 2-story farmhouse with peeling gray paint, a sagging porch, and boarded-up windows. It looked like a setting for a horror film. She parked the car and stepped out, the silence of the dead orchard immediately pressing in on her. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of dead branches under her boots. Before she could even unlock the front door of the farmhouse, the crunch of heavy tires on gravel broke the silence. A pristine, black Range Rover pulled into the driveway, stopping right behind her Civic. A man stepped out. He was in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that looked absurdly out of place in the mud and rot of the farm. He wore an expensive silver watch and a smile that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. "You must be Rachel," the man called out, walking smoothly over the uneven ground. "I'm Anthony Croft. I was a neighbor of sorts to your grandfather." Rachel crossed her arms, instantly on guard. "Mr. Croft, my lawyer mentioned you. You're the one trying to buy this place." "Trying is a strong word," Anthony chuckled, though his eyes darted rapidly across the property, scanning the dead trees with an odd intensity. "I'm offering a mercy buyout. This land is dead, Rachel. Has been for 40 years. The soil is toxic from whatever chemical pesticides Caleb tried to use to save it back in the day. It's useless for farming, and it's a massive liability for you." "If it's so useless, why do you want it?" Rachel asked, her eyes narrowing. Anthony didn't miss a beat. "Scraping it clean. I'm building the Oakhaven Estates a mile down the road. I need this land for a drainage reservoir. It's purely logistical. I heard about your financial situation in Seattle. $35,000 is a very generous offer for a toxic dump. Sign the papers today, and I'll even bump it to 40. Cash." Rachel looked at Anthony. She looked at the Range Rover. Then she looked back at the dilapidated house. $40,000. She could walk away right now. But then she remembered her grandfather's note. "Don't let the wolves have the roots." Anthony Croft practically reeked of wolf. "I'm going to take a few days to think about it," Rachel said firmly. "I want to sort through my grandfather's things." Anthony's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. But Rachel caught it. A flash of genuine panic. "Caleb was a hoarder, Rachel," Anthony said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its friendly veneer. "There's nothing in that house but trash and rat droppings. You're making a mistake. The county will seize this land in 90 days, and you'll get nothing. Don't be foolish like he was." "Get off my property, Mr. Croft," Rachel said, turning her back on him and sliding the heavy brass key into the front door. She heard him scoff, followed by the heavy slam of the Range Rover's door. As he drove away, Rachel finally pushed open the door to the farmhouse. The smell of dust, old paper, and stale tobacco hit her like a physical force. Anthony had been right about one thing. Caleb was a hoarder. Floor-to-ceiling stacks of newspapers, bizarre mechanical parts, and countless mason jars filled with soil samples cluttered every inch of the living room. But Rachel wasn't leaving. She locked the door behind her, dropped her bags, and began to search. For 3 grueling days, Rachel tore through the farmhouse. She battled spiders, inhaled decades of dust, and sifted through thousands of pages of Caleb's manic scribblings. Most of it was incomprehensible, rambling theories about soil pH levels, government surveillance, and the history of Oakhaven's founding families. She found nothing of value. No hidden cash, no bonds, no secret bank accounts, just a house full of junk and a rising sense of despair. By the 4th morning, a torrential summer thunderstorm rolled through the valley, turning the dead orchard into a muddy, impassable swamp. Rachel sat on the sagging front porch, drinking bitter instant coffee, watching the rain hammer the dead trees. Her phone buzzed. It was an automated text from her bank in Seattle. Account overdrawn, minus $42.18. Tears pricked her eyes. She was a fool. Anthony Croft was probably sitting in a leather chair somewhere, laughing at her. She had let a cryptic note from a paranoid old man convince her to turn down $40,000. She resolved to call David Henson on Monday and accept Croft's offer. The fight was over. The rain finally broke by mid-afternoon, leaving a heavy, humid mist hanging over the property. Rachel decided to take one last walk around the grounds before packing her things. She wandered past the rusted remains of an old tractor, heading toward the back of the property where the trees grew thickest, their dead branches weaving together into a dense grey canopy. As she navigated a particularly thorny patch of dead blackberry bushes, she noticed something odd. The ground here was different. The rest of the orchard was flat, but in this specific clearing there was a subtle, unnatural depression in the earth, forming a wide, shallow bowl. In the center of the depression sat a massive, rusted iron wheel, like a valve from an old steamship, half buried in the mud and overgrown with aggressive vines. "Look under the iron." Rachel's pulse spiked. She scrambled down the muddy embankment into the center of the depression. She grabbed the heavy iron wheel, her hands slipping on the wet rust and moss. She planted her boots in the mud, braced her legs, and pulled with all her might. It wouldn't budge. It was bolted to something beneath the soil. Frustrated, she grabbed a thick, broken tree branch and began digging furiously around the edges of the iron wheel. The recent storm had softened the dead, clay-like earth. As she scraped away the mud, her makeshift wooden shovel hit something hard. Metal. She dropped to her knees, using her bare hands to claw away the dirt. Beneath the iron wheel was a massive, square steel grate, set into a concrete foundation. It looked like a heavy-duty storm drain, but there were no municipal sewer lines out here. Suddenly, a loud, terrifying crack echoed through the clearing. The earth beneath Rachel shifted violently. The torrential rain had compromised the integrity of the soil around the heavy concrete foundation. Before Rachel could scramble backward, the ground completely gave way. She screamed as the earth collapsed, swallowing her whole. She fell through a cascade of mud, roots, and soreness, sliding down a steep, terrifying chute of collapsing soil. She hit the ground hard, rolling across cold, jagged stone, her shoulder colliding with a wall. For a moment, she just lay there in pitch blackness, coughing up dust, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The smell down here was overwhelming. Damp limestone, ancient mildew, and something else. Something chemical and sharp. "Help!" she yelled, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the heavy, claustrophobic darkness. Trembling, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen was cracked, but it still turned on. She activated the flashlight. The beam of light pierced the gloom, and Rachel gasped. She wasn't in a sinkhole. She wasn't in a natural cave. She was sitting on the floor of a perfectly constructed subterranean tunnel. The walls were lined with expertly laid red brick, arching over her head. Thick industrial copper pipes ran along the ceiling, draped in decades of heavy cobwebs. Rachel stood up, wincing at the pain in her shoulder. She shined the light upward. The hole she had fallen through was a good 15 feet above her, a jagged tear in the tunnel's ceiling where the old concrete shaft had finally caved in. The iron wheel and grate were suspended precariously in the mud above. There was no way she could climb back out. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but the sheer impossibility of what she was looking at forced her to focus. Why was there a massive, brick-lined tunnel running beneath a dead apple orchard? She had no choice but to follow it. Pointing her phone flashlight forward, she began to walk. The tunnel was long and slightly sloped downward. As she moved, she noticed small alcoves cut into the brickwork. Inside the alcoves were old wooden crates, rotting away to reveal their contents, thick glass bottles caked in dust. Rachel picked one up, wiping the grime from the label with her thumb. It was a bottle of rye whiskey. The label read, Oakhaven Distillery, bottled 1923, Prohibition. This was a rum-running tunnel. But as she continued walking, the historical novelty quickly shifted into something much more modern and alarming. About 200 yards down the passage, the brick walls gave way to a modern reinforcement. Steel I-beams supported the ceiling, and thick electrical wiring was stapled to the walls. At the end of the tunnel, the path was blocked by a massive reinforced steel door, the kind you would see on a bank vault or a panic room. It looked entirely out of place, glaringly modern compared to the 1920s brickwork. And on the door, holding a heavy sliding latch in place, was a brand new titanium padlock. Someone had been down here recently. Grandpa Caleb? Or someone else? Rachel approached the door, her light catching on something resting on a small wooden crate to her left. It was a heavy, yellow Stanley crowbar and a pair of bolt cutters. Caleb had been trying to get in, or he had been the one who locked it. She picked up the bolt cutters. They were incredibly heavy, requiring both her arms to lift. She positioned the jaws over the titanium shackle of the padlock, braced the handles against her hip, and threw all her body weight onto them. The metal groaned. Rachel gritted her teeth, pushing until her muscles screamed. With a sharp, violently loud snap that echoed down the tunnel, the padlock broke. She tossed the cutters aside, her hands shaking, and pulled the heavy steel latch back. She grabbed the handle of the vault door and pulled. The heavy hinges screamed in protest, but the door swung outward. Rachel raised her phone, stepping into the antechamber beyond. The air in this room was dry and climate-controlled. Her flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating stacks of plastic storage bins, several metal filing cabinets, and a large wooden desk. But it was what was pinned to the corkboard behind the desk that made Rachel's blood run cold. It was a sprawling, chaotic web of photographs, newspaper clippings, and financial records, all connected by red string. In the center of the board was a massive, black-and-white photograph of a younger Anthony Croft, standing next to a group of men in suits. Above the photograph, written in thick black marker, were the words, "They poisoned the land. They stole the town. I have the proof." Caleb hadn't been a crazy hoarder. He hadn't failed at farming. His orchard hadn't died from a natural blight. It had been murdered. Rachel walked slowly to the desk. Sitting perfectly centered on the blotter was a leather-bound ledger. She opened it to the first page. It was a detailed, meticulously documented ledger of bribes, toxic waste-dumping logs, and illegal land seizures orchestrated by the Croft family over the last 50 years. Anthony Croft didn't want the land to build a drainage reservoir. He wanted the land because the evidence that could send him and his entire empire to federal prison for the rest of their lives was buried right beneath it. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the far end of the tunnel behind her, the distinct crunch of heavy boots on stone. "Caleb, you paranoid old bastard," a voice echoed through the darkness. It was Anthony Croft. "I knew there was another entrance." Rachel slammed the ledger shut, clicking off her flashlight, plunging the vault into absolute darkness. Rachel pressed her back against the cold steel of the filing cabinet, scarcely daring to breathe. The heavy rhythmic thud of Anthony Croft's boots echoed louder as he approached the breached vault. "Caleb, you were a persistent old rat." Croft's voice drifted down the tunnel, dripping with arrogant amusement. "I spent a week looking for the main entrance after you finally kicked the bucket. Should have known you'd rig a cave-in to hide the primary shaft. But my surveyors found the secondary ventilation grate on the ridge. You couldn't hide this forever." A brilliant, blinding beam of an LED flashlight pierced the darkness of the antechamber, sweeping across the concrete floor. Rachel squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her knees to her chest. She had slipped the leather-bound ledger into her oversized coat pocket the second she heard him coming, but the corkboard, a damning tapestry of Croft's crimes, was still glaringly visible. The beam of light hit the corkboard. The flashlight steadied. "Well," Croft whispered, the amusement instantly vanishing from his voice. "Look at this." The old fool actually put it all together. Rachel knew she had seconds before he swept the rest of the room. She was trapped in a dead-end bunker with a ruthless billionaire who had just discovered his own undoing. Her eyes darted around the dim periphery of the room, catching the faint silhouette of the heavy wooden crate near the door, and the yellow Stanley crowbar resting on the floor where she had dropped it. "Griggs!" Croft barked over his shoulder, his voice echoing back up the tunnel. "Get down here! We have a bonfire to build. Bring the gasoline!" He wasn't alone. Panic flared in Rachel's chest, but it was quickly eclipsed by a surge of white-hot adrenaline. She wasn't about to let her grandfather's life work burn, and she certainly wasn't going to die in a Prohibition-era tunnel. As Croft stepped fully into the vault, mesmerized by the corkboard, Rachel reached blindly into the darkness to her left. Her fingers brushed against one of the glass bottles she had seen earlier, the heavy, unopened rye whiskey from 1923. She gripped the dusty neck of the bottle, her knuckles turning white. Taking a deep, silent breath, she hurled the bottle as hard as she could into the far corner of the vault. It shattered against the brick with a deafening crash, the smell of ancient, potent alcohol instantly filling the dry air. Croft spun around, his flashlight wildly tracking toward the noise, a startled curse escaping his lips. "Who's there?" Using the distraction, Rachel lunged from her hiding spot. She didn't run toward the back of the room. She lunged straight for the heavy steel vault door. Croft heard her boots hit the concrete and swung the flashlight back, the blinding beam catching her right in the eyes. "You!" Croft shouted, realizing instantly who she was. "Stop!" He reached into his jacket, but Rachel was already in motion. She grabbed the massive handle of the vault door. Her grandfather had maintained the hinges, and the heavy steel swung inward with terrifying momentum. Croft lunged forward to stop it, but he was a second too late. The heavy door slammed shut, catching Croft's shoulder and throwing him backward into the vault. Rachel slammed the heavy exterior latch into place. Her hands were shaking violently as she scooped up the heavy yellow crowbar from the floor. She jammed it vertically through the steel handles of the latch mechanism, effectively wedging the door shut from the outside. Almost immediately, the muffled sound of heavy fists began pounding against the thick steel from the inside. "Rachel, open this door!" Croft's voice was muffled, laced with sudden, absolute panic. "You have no idea what you're messing with." "I think I do, Anthony," Rachel gasped, leaning her forehead against the cold steel. A heavy, echoing footstep at the far end of the tunnel made her freeze. Griggs. Croft's muscle was coming down the passage. Rachel didn't have a flashlight anymore. She turned and ran blindly up the tunnel, letting her left hand trail against the damp brick wall to guide her. The incline was steep, and her lungs burned with the effort. Behind her, The faint beam of another flashlight appeared in the distance. "Mr. Croft," a gruff voice echoed. Rachel pushed her legs harder, her boots slipping on the slick stone. She ran for what felt like miles, but was likely only a few hundred yards, until the brick tunnel ended abruptly at a modern, concrete stairwell. She scrambled up the steps, hitting her hands against a heavy wooden trapdoor. She shoved it upward. It was heavy, covered in debris, but it gave way. Rachel spilled out into the damp twilight air of the Oregon woods, gasping for breath. She was about half a mile from the farmhouse, near the edge of the property line. She didn't stop to rest. She ran through the thorny underbrush, ignoring the branches tearing at her clothes, until she saw the silhouette of her beat-up Honda Civic parked in the driveway. She practically threw herself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. As she threw the car into drive and sped down the gravel driveway, she saw a large, imposing man burst from the tree line in her rearview mirror. It was Griggs. He watched her taillights fade into the mist, holding a red gasoline can. Rachel pulled the leather ledger from her pocket, tossing it onto the passenger seat. She wasn't going to the Oak Haven police. If Croft owned the town, he owned the sheriff. She pointed the Civic north, toward Portland. She was going straight to the federal government. By 9 a.m. the next morning, Rachel was sitting in a sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room inside the Environmental Protection Agency's regional headquarters in Portland. Across from her sat Special Agent Thomas Harrison, a stern-faced investigator with the FBI's Environmental Crimes Division, and a team of forensic accountants. Rachel hadn't slept. She was covered in mud. Her hair was a tangled mess, and she was nursing a bruised shoulder, but her eyes were wide awake. Agent Harrison carefully turned the fragile pages of Caleb Higgins' ledger, his expression growing darker with every entry. "These coordinates," Harrison said, pointing to a column of numbers scrawled in Caleb's erratic handwriting. "These match the dumping logs of Croft Chemical Processing from 1982 to 1989. And the bank routing numbers here. These match offshore accounts tied to the local zoning board in Oak Haven." "My grandfather wasn't crazy," Rachel said, her voice raspy but firm. "He was building a case. Croft's company dumped thousands of gallons of heavy metals and illegal solvents into the groundwater beneath Whispering Pines. It killed the orchard. Then, Croft bribed the local officials to look the other way, intentionally destroying the town's agricultural economy so he could buy up the bankrupt farms for pennies on the dollar." Harrison looked up, adjusting his tie. "Ms. Higgins, if this ledger is authentic, Anthony Croft hasn't just committed fraud. He's committed massive environmental terrorism. But we need physical proof. A ledger alone can be contested in court by high-priced defense attorneys." Rachel smiled, a slow, triumphant grin spreading across her exhausted face. "Agent Harrison," she said, "when I was cleaning out my grandfather's house, I thought he was a hoarder. His living room is filled with hundreds of mason jars. I thought it was just dirt." She leaned forward. "They are meticulously labeled soil and groundwater samples, dating back 40 years. The physical evidence is sitting in his living room." The ensuing raid was the largest law enforcement operation Oak Haven had ever seen. Within 48 hours, a convoy of black SUVs and hazardous materials trucks descended upon the Whispering Pines property. They found the farmhouse exactly as Rachel had left it. The hundreds of mason jars serving as a pristine, uncontaminated chain of evidence that perfectly corroborated the ledger. When the FBI breached the underground vault, they found Anthony Croft severely dehydrated and huddled in the corner. Griggs had fled the state the moment Rachel escaped, abandoning his boss in the bunker rather than facing kidnapping charges. Croft was arrested on the spot, his tailored suit ruined by the damp chill of the subterranean cell. The fallout was catastrophic for Croft Enterprises. The national media seized the story, the billionaire who poisoned a town, and the graphic designer who unearthed his empire of dirt. The investigations revealed that the land Croft was currently developing for his luxury Oak Haven estates was also sitting on a massive, undocumented, toxic plume. The state seized Croft's assets. The luxury development was halted permanently, and a federal judge ordered Croft Enterprises into immediate liquidation to pay for the environmental remediation of Oak Haven. 6 months later, Rachel stood on the front porch of the farmhouse. The peeling grey paint had been scraped away, replaced by a warm, inviting white. The property was bustling with activity. Teams of environmental engineers in high-visibility vests were operating heavy machinery, carefully removing the top layers of the poisoned soil and treating the earth beneath. David Henson, the lawyer who had once urged her to sell the property for $35,000, pulled up the driveway. He looked remarkably more respectful today. The final settlement papers from the Federal Victim Compensation Fund came through, Rachel, David said, handing her a thick manila envelope. After the liquidation of Croft's assets and the punitive damages awarded by the state, you're looking at an 8-figure settlement. Rachel took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in her hands. She had paid off her business debts months ago. The $70,000 that had once felt like an insurmountable mountain was now a rounding error in her bank account. "Thank you, David," she said, looking out over the property. "What are you going to do with all this land?" David asked, looking at the skeletal trees being uprooted by the excavators. "You don't have to stay here, you know. You could buy a penthouse in Seattle. You could go anywhere." Rachel looked down at a small, framed photograph she had found hidden in the floorboards of the farmhouse during the renovations. It was a picture of a younger, smiling Caleb Higgins, standing proudly next to a vibrant, blooming apple tree. "No," Rachel said softly, a genuine smile touching her lips. "I think I'll stay. The engineers said the soil will be completely clean by next spring." She looked up at the vast, open Oregon sky. "I'm going to plant some roots. Whispering Pines is going back into the apple business." What an incredible journey of resilience and uncovering the truth. Rachel's grandfather wasn't losing his mind. He was the only one brave enough to fight for his land. If this story of the hidden tunnel, corporate greed, and ultimate justice kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button to support the channel. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a gripping real-life mystery, and subscribe for more amazing stories.